Hello, welcome to our podcast today entitled The Future is Now, the Strategic Planning Process for Nonprofits. My name is Regina Hopkins and I am the Assistant Executive Director of the DC Bar Pro Bono Center. Our mission is to provide DC nonprofits with information and training and pro bono legal assistance and representation. Our co-sponsor is the Center for Nonprofit Advancement, which provides technical support and assistance to nonprofits in the DC area and the Commonwealth of Virginia. It also advocates on behalf of the nonprofit sector. And we are speaking today with Don Tebbe. Don has dedicated his life to helping nonprofit executives and organizations navigate changes in strategy and leadership. He has been a leader in the nonprofit sector since 1983, first serving 10 years as an executive and CEO of several capacity building organizations. And he founded his consulting practice in 1993, focusing on planning, leadership succession, and CEO transitions. And over the past 24 years, he has been an advisor to over 200 nonprofits on planning and succession projects. He's a frequent speaker at conferences across the country and has been quoted by Time, Monster Inc., the Stanford Social Innovation Review, and numerous newspapers across the U.S. And he's the author of 2 books on leadership succession and transition and 1 on board governance for practices. So welcome, Don. Thank you for being here today.
Well, thanks for the opportunity and to join you for this, one of my favorite topics. I guess that makes me a full-blown geek because I really love talking about planning.
Yes. So we're going to start today. You hear the term strategic planning all the time, but I don't know that people have a really good idea in their mind of exactly what it is. So maybe we could start by just giving us in a few short sentences, what exactly is a strategic plan and why does my organization want one?
Well, yeah, there's so many different definitions of strategic planning, and talk about strategic planning is dead and it's no longer relevant. To me, it's as relevant as ever. But you know, my definition of strategic planning really speaks to the 2 outcomes that it should provide. First of all, it's a plan that positions your organization in the future. So you've anticipated the future, you've looked at it, you've carved out a social impact vision that you want for the results of the work of your organization, number 1. So that positioning the organization in the future. Second of all, it's an alignment creating mechanism to create alignment with everyone in the organization, everyone involved, so they know what the game plan is and what we're all striving for. So to me, any plan that meets those 2 results in those 2 outcomes, I think, is a strategic plan.
Okay, and so it sounds like it's something that really every nonprofit should have, some sort of sense of the future, and then getting everybody on a common direction to achieve that future result.
Yes, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that a lot of nonprofits do is they get a little intimidated by the whole strategic planning process. It seems very complicated. You hear a lot of terminology thrown around. This is you need an environmental scan. You got to do this. You got to do that. And stuff. And so I think people feel a little overwhelmed by the idea of doing a strategic plan. So I guess the question is this really how complicated does this process have to be?
It doesn't have to be all that complicated. I think one of the things that, one of the first pieces of advice I would offer to executives is, first of all, to calibrate the plan to the complexity of the organization. There's a rule from systems theory called the law of requisite variety, and big words for basically the simple concept that anything that you do, whether it's a plan or whether it's a monitoring mechanism, that plan or that monitoring mechanism should be no more complicated than the system that it's representing. For a small organization, you can really you could do great work. Back to that idea of positioning your organization for the future and creating alignment with among your people. You can do great work by just simply answering 4 questions. I can speak to those in a moment, but I think one of the big mistakes that a lot of nonprofit leaders make is that they go out and buy the book, and then they try to do their planning by the book. And so they're borrowing somebody else's template, some consultant's good idea about, what planning should look like, and they try and do these kitchen sink processes where they exhaust themselves in it, and it just gets way too complicated. If you've got a small organization, then your planning should be calibrated to that. If you've got a huge organization like a university or something like that, then obviously you want to do something more complicated. I think the other thing that with the buy the book kind of approaches is that they assume that there's one time horizon. And I think that's another mistake that a lot of nonprofits make, is that they don't really take into consideration sort of the dynamics of their marketplace. If you're a university and you're needing to plan for facilities and you need to forecast what the student body of 2042 is going to look like, so you can make sure that you have enough housing and classroom space and so forth, that's one thing. But if you're a public policy organization that's trying to sort out what Congress is going to do this congressional cycle, that's a whole nother planning dynamic. And so I think that's another place where nonprofit executives kind of get themselves wrapped around the axle, is that they're borrowing somebody else's template, and it's really not fitting their organization. So for a small organization, I think you can really get by. You can do great planning work with simply asking or answering 4 questions. Where do we stand now? What's the basic characteristics of our organization right now, our identity, our work today, so forth, number 1. Number 2, where are we headed, or where should we be headed? What's and over what time horizon? If it's a very dynamic environment, you may be planning from from year to year. If you've got an institutional setting, you may be planning for decades. Again, back to that kind of time horizon. But where are we headed, or where should we be headed? What's our vision, of our organization, for our organization? What kind of impact do we want to make? And I speak to social impact vision in a moment. But so that's number 2, where are we headed? Number 3 is, what's our path forward? What's our game plan? What's the logical path forward to between where we are now and where we want the organization to be? And then the 4th question is, and this one oftentimes gets dropped out, and that's, what's standing in our way? There's great research out there that suggests, the university research that suggests that people and organizations that anticipate the barriers in their planning work are much more effective, because they don't get tripped up. Because the tendency for a lot of folks when they're doing planning is to be, have very optimistic. You get in the room, you're kind of in a retreat setting, and everybody's feeling good, and they've just you've just rewritten your vision statement, and everybody's all excited, and of course you want to shoot for the moon, and you realize that maybe you just don't have that much horsepower in the organization, or that much rocket fuel, and that you need to scale back. Or second of all, they shoot for the moon, but they don't realize some of the barriers that they're going to confront along the way. So anticipating some of those barriers kind of introduces realism to the process. It makes it much more natural, so that when you confront some of those barriers 2-3 months down the road, the board's not back there thinking, kind of in this mindset of this rosy scenario, and you've been slogging away at this, and you're running up against these barriers, and now you have to kind of sheepishly go back to the board and say, well, we didn't meet our targets, and then it kind of sounds like an excuse. If you had some of those conversations ahead of time, I think there would be a much more realistic picture. So where do we stand? Where are we headed? What's our path forward? And what's standing in our way? Those 4 questions really, if you start with that and did nothing else, that would be a great plan.
Hmm. You mentioned, sometimes people don't think about the obstacles, and they get a little bit too complicated in their process. They make it overly complicated. Are there any other common mistakes that people make when they're developing a strategic plan?
Well, I think the one of the biggest mistakes, first of all, is that they don't do it. Um, there's research out there that says that 55% of nonprofits don't have a strategic plan or their plan is out of date. About 18% of nonprofits have never had a plan or their plan is more than 5 years out of date. And about 37% haven't updated their plan in the last 3 years. So number one, they just don't do it. And I think that's partially because a big component of that is that they do that by the book kind of strategic planning. They exhaust themselves on it, and nobody wants to bring the term up again because they remember what a horrendous experience and lengthy process it was last time. And guess what? We put all that effort into it, and the plan's out of date. So I think first of all, setting all that by the book idea aside, calibrating the plan to the size of your organization and thinking about it differently. Remember I said earlier my definition of strategic planning is position the organization in the future, but the second piece of that is creating alignment to think of planning not as an episodic event, something that we do every 3 years and, oh, well, we did our planning thing, wipe our hands and go on, back to work business as usual, but to think of planning as a strategic conversation, a way of navigating, thinking of your plan as a navigation tool as opposed to something that you periodically do and then put on the shelf. So I think that's the one of the big things is that first of all they don't do it. Second of all, they go into it with the wrong mindset. And I think in terms of there are some particular things that I think in terms of calibrating the plan to the organization's situation that so I guess basically the point is that a lot of times people develop the wrong plan or develop the plan that really doesn't fit the dynamics of the organization. For example, if your organization is, one of the things that I always looked at was the organization's business model. Basically, the business model is it's the basic rationale in the organization for how do you produce work and how do you get paid for producing that work. Does that business model work? Does it have some runway in front of it? I think that's one of the big challenges for a lot of nonprofits is that they don't have an effective business model, or they don't have a complete conception of that business model, so they have difficulty managing that. If you don't have the perspective on the system, you can't really manage the system. So I think making sure that if you're facing a very dynamic environment, that really to look at your business model. I think other things that I would look at in terms of where the plans aren't calibrated to the organization's future. One of the big things is succession planning. There's a huge cohort of baby boomers that are heading towards retirement years, and a lot of times the planning work is sort of blind to that, or treats it as sort of an externality, and that the plan is focused on the program but doesn't take into account the business platform that's supporting that program. Other things, just the dynamics of the environment, a lot of environmental uncertainty, and seems to be a kind of an epidemic around that, is rather than think strategic planning where you're thinking kind of the traditional by the book model, 3 years out, to think about it in terms of maybe we need an interim plan, maybe we need to do some scenario planning to try and sort out the immediate future, and then go into another planning cycle. And I think the final thing I would say about mistakes nonprofits make, it's sort of back to that idea of treating planning as a navigation tool, but also thinking about it as a way of having really good conversations in your organization, conversations for outcomes, conversations for possibilities, and to recognize that if you think of this, if you think of planning as a navigation tool and something that you're keeping refreshed constantly and before you, it really what it does is that it creates planning competency in the organization. It gets everyone focused on outcomes. In the clients that I've worked with over the years, where they really take on the strategic planning cycle and they calibrate it to their business dynamics, it's remarkable to watch them grow in their sophistication of their planning, the conversations that they're having, the conversations that the executive and board are having with each other. It really just elevates and puts air under the wings of the organization.
Mm-hmm. When I've done strategic planning in the past, the thing that I see a lot of people trip over, it's not so much the planning process itself, but the implementation of the process. Because, strategic planning, at least as I've experienced it, involves choices. Like, we're going to do more of this and less of that, in the future as we go forward. And people are great about the more of this, but they really struggle with the less of that,
Mm-hmm.
because of the human implications and the like. So, so I've developed this. I've answered all these questions. How do I make sure that it's just not something I put, as you say, put on a shelf and don't think about for 5 years?
Well, I think that's another area where I think nonprofits make a mistake, and that is they do the plan and sort of check it off the list, and then don't really think about it again. There's some data out there that suggests, I think it's something like half of nonprofits that have a strategic plan the board hasn't really checked in on it in the last year, and that seems like a terrible waste. And several years ago, I did some case study research looking at governance practices in highly effective nonprofits. And one of the things that I came away with, just struck by, what the quality of the relationship between the board and the executive. If you start off with the idea that, first of all, a board has 3 jobs, right? It's supposed to, set the mission, work with the executive, set the mission, vision of the organization. Second of all, to ensure leadership and resources. And third, to be accountable for the performance of the organization, including the board's own performance. That doesn't spontaneously happen. I think the executive, that's what I saw in these organizations, is that the executive had a big hand in helping the board fulfill those 3 jobs. And what I saw in these organizations, what really struck me, is what I would call the board executive social contract. They had a plan, but the plan was part of the conversation between the board and the executive, and it was part of this kind of this contracting process. It wasn't a literal contract in the sense that you folks who are attorneys would think of, but more of a social contract, kind of an unspoken or kind of set of assumptions about how we work together. And what really struck me was that in these organizations there were 4 components to that relationship in most of the organizations. Number one, they were really clear about their priorities. What they were striving for as an organization, and what that meant, what was on this year's agenda, and I would characterize that as that these organizations had a leadership agenda. It was taking their strategic plan, and bringing it into the board conversation. Second of all, that then gave them an opportunity to really kind of clarify the board's role and contributions to that. Most board members come into an organization, come into their volunteer role dying to make a difference. I mean, that's why they volunteer. That's why they're there. And, we give them this kind of boring governance stuff to do when we could really enliven them with the work of the organization by bringing those, these strategic conversations into the boardroom. So second area was that they were clear about their roles and responsibilities. And third, they were clear about their contributions towards those plans. And fourth and finally, they were very clear about how they were going to monitor and evaluate performance. So I think one of the biggest problems with planning is that people it becomes shelfware, and when it really could be a very enlivening conversation throughout the organization, but especially starting with the board, because the board just that's why they're there. They want to make a difference.
So developing a strategic plan is really just the first step in a process, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I think so. Back to what we talked about earlier, is organizations oftentimes exhaust themselves, in the planning process, and then they're sick of it. Nobody wants to, don't utter the words strategic planning to me again. We're done with it for a while, so that's a result of some exhaustion. They made the planning process too complicated. The Pareto principle, the flipping, the 80-20 principle. I think a lot of organizations would really benefit if they flipped the 80-20. A lot of organizations, they spend 80% of their planning effort producing the plan, trying to get the plan right, and they spend about 20% at best on follow-up. My suggestion is flip that. Spend 20% on the planning. You can do great planning very quickly, in a few hours, in a few days, and so calibrate again. Back the idea of calibrating the plan to the complexity of the organization, and then think about how you can enliven the organization, how you can keep these strategic imperatives in front of folks with, without using the jargon I'm using, but how can you use that plan to create strategic conversations in your organization, to create those aligning conversations. And to me, that's the real work of the planning work. It's the navigation work, not the planning work itself.
Mm-hmm. And I guess as a final question, so I'm one of those ones who've never planned, or I haven't looked at my plan in God knows how long. So what should I do to get my planning process back on track?
Well, I think just to get started, I mentioned earlier those 4 questions that I think are great starting questions. Where do we stand? Where are we headed, or should we be headed? What's our path forward, and what's standing in our way? I think getting your board together for a Saturday morning, particularly if, obviously if you're a university, you're going to have it, or a major institution, with facilities and things like that, you need a different set of plans. But if you're a community-based nonprofit, if you did nothing more than start there, number one, with those 4 questions. Number 2, put that, back to that idea, that board executive social contract. Take those priorities that comes out of that planning work and put that on every board agenda. Create a section or a time on the board. It doesn't have to be 20 minutes. It could be 20 minutes, but a section, a devoted section that's sacrosanct, and call it Outlook or Future Directions or whatever, but carve out time on the board agenda so you can have those strategic priorities as a touchstone, and so that it then opens up the conversation with the board, that where the board can really kind of fulfill this role, because then it gives you the opening to talk about what kind of barriers you're confronting, where you might need some more resources, or maybe doing some capacity building, that sort of thing. So answering those 4 questions, and then as a follow-up, literally put those priorities on your board agenda for every meeting. Keep the conversation alive.
Sounds like a plan. Thank you, Don, so much for taking time to talk to us today. If all I have to do is answer 4 questions, I have to say it does make me feel, like I can do this. I can do this. So thank you so much.
And, all right. Well, thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.